Hi, everyone. Welcome to Global Migrant Festival. This is an interview with Golriz Ghahraman. I am Yolanda Yu, your moderator. Golriz Ghahraman is an Iranian-born New Zealand politician, member of parliament, and author. The former United Nations lawyer was a child asylum seeker and became the first refugee elected to New Zealand's parliament. She is a member of the New Zealand House of Representatives for the Green Party. She has also published a memoir recently. Welcome, Golriz.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful.
Perfect. So may I start with the first question just to warm up a little? How has your refugee background, especially as a colored woman from ethnic minority, impacted your life, your perspectives, and also your career choices?
Yeah, I think we can't help but live as women of color from migrant or refugee backgrounds, bringing our faces, our backgrounds, and our experiences with us. So I'm not sure in what ways it has impacted my path, but I think it impacts my work whenever I've gotten there. When I became a lawyer, I wanted to do that in order to learn how to apply human rights. I wanted to make human rights effective. And I mean, I do think about whether I went towards a human rights field because of my refugee background and because, my family lost so much in order to kind of have human rights over here in New Zealand. But I think more than that, it's once you enter a field like that, being kind of one of the only ones who looks a certain way and has a certain background. And so you have to kind of work around that and kind of bring your cultural awareness to your work. And in politics, it works in the same way. I didn't intend to become the first refugee, so-called refugee MP, but someone figured out that if I won, that I would become the first refugee MP. And I realized actually this means a lot to a lot of different people. And in terms of all of the love that I received from others from a refugee background, from the Middle Eastern background, from the so-called Muslim world. And I'm not actually Muslim, but I understand the representation of having, been from that part of the world. And so this was incredible. I realized there's a real void there for people. They hadn't seen anyone like them in Parliament before, and they hadn't seen anyone express their issues, whether it was racism, whether it was migrant issues, whether it was global issues, as we understand it, those of us from the global south. But I also then realized it also means something else. And the fact that there had been this void, was maybe because those doors were closed and there was all of this prejudice and there was, hate. And so, I started to receive that message as well. So it only kind of made my resolve stronger to kind of keep going and keep representing, because that's what's important to democracy, is kind of that we do have a diverse range of ideas, and that comes from our background as well as our, I had naively thought I was bringing my legal background and my human rights work as a Green Party candidate, but it turned out there was something more that I needed to focus on as well.
That's interesting. You are saying it just sort of happened, right? Whatever background, that's what you were born with. And then but you start to realize there is a certain power in that. And so that now you can, from this point onward, you can deliver your message.
Absolutely. I think I realized that a while ago in the different roles that I held, but not quite the extent of it. It has always had meaning for me, and it has an impact on us as women, as minority background women, to come into spaces where we're not represented, whether that's the law, whether it's a courtroom, whether it's writing a book and dealing with publishers. So we all feel that impact. We know that there's something about that institution that's not used to us, and we have to present ourselves more strongly in order to sort of get there. But in politics, I realized that because I had a public life as well, that it was, you know, that those parts of my identity meant something more than what they mean to me, because there's a public reaction as well, and it was meaningful for some communities in a positive way, and it was meaningful to other communities in a very negative way, and that was something, you know, that I needed to work on as part of my job, as you know, and we're working for New Zealand ultimately, but New Zealand isn't a place that wants to have that prejudice there either. So it became a really strong part of the work that I do.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned this public life, which could be kind of part of you, but not necessarily part of you. So you also mentioned this. I actually watched your YouTube video as well on how you are talking about, you know, the threats that you receive after the Christchurch attack, and that caused also anxiety. I kind of feel even more for you when you say, you know, you feel all this anxiety and the microaggression that is so real in the minority people's life, and also the other voices that are trying to silence you, and yet you have that courage to continue to face it and continue to do this job as who you are and whatever background that you come from, right? As you said, it means negatively to some people. And where do you find that courage to deal with all this?
Yeah, so I started to get the sort of mass online sort of abuse, and then it turned into threats almost immediately when I became a candidate. I wasn't even elected yet, but it was sort of to the point where the first time I spoke in Parliament, you do a maiden speech, so to speak. So you kind of lay out your purpose in Parliament and your background, and every new MP does this. But when I did my maiden speech, I felt like I had to talk about this because it was such a big part of the experience of having been a candidate. The fact that I would get, you know, racist threats and abuse, and I did stand there, and I think to some extent I felt like I had to do this because politics is sometimes part of the kind of the prejudice that migrants feel. You know, there were politicians in that room in Parliament who had contributed to the experience of prejudice that migrants and refugees have here in New Zealand and also globally. So I was now part of this institution. I had to kind of talk about that experience as a representative, and I even talked about getting threats of gun violence because people assumed that I was Muslim, and that's a part of the experience that people have. And then 18 months later, Christchurch, the terror attacks happened, and it's very chilling to think that, you know, there were people in that community and in the refugee and migrants of color community, in particular the Muslim community, who had been receiving threats like this, had been reporting it, and I had some idea of what that felt like, but it had gone sort of unnoticed. And then finally there was a mass crime, and actually the threats didn't sort of go down. You know, there was a moment of love and togetherness across the country, and I think overwhelmingly New Zealanders understood that, you know, this, and they were horrified and shocked and just wanted to protect that community. But in terms of the white supremacist threats, they actually went up about a week or so later. And I kind of felt that too. And I think that's the video you're talking about. And I was speaking out because I'd gotten security assigned to me, and you know, it was being taken seriously, and I was being questioned about it as well because people were shocked. But I think it's not about sort of the courage that I have in going on, because I'm actually, you know, I do experience anxiety, and it's absolutely unsettling to know that there's these threats, but also even just the lower level abuse whenever you have to face racism on any level, even when it's just someone questioning your qualifications for no reason, if someone is questioning your right to be there, it's still, and it's those microaggressions that cause us all of this daily stress. But everybody out there on the street is, you know, who are from a similar background, is experiencing that too. So the courage that, you know, you might think I have, is nothing compared to what they have to go through. And I know that that's my responsibility. I have to speak about that experience, because it's, you know, every hijabi woman that's walking her child to school, or, you know, the elder members of the Muslim community, the Sikh community, who get mistaken for that, you know. And we have, after the COVID virus hit New Zealand, we had hate crimes and even violence against our East Asian community. You know, so Chinese, Korean, Japanese communities were experiencing this because, again, we can't shed our skin, and you go out into the world with our faces and our backgrounds, and that anxiety must be 100-fold to what I have to go through. At least I have access to security. So when I came to write a book, it was important to me to capture that experience of being a refugee, but also the experience of being Iranian for my parents and that generation of Iranians who went through the oppression of the Islamic regime there, and sort of what led to us becoming refugees. Because I think that's always a misunderstanding that people have, is that you're just choosing this life, whereas, you know, there's been so much that's probably come before it in terms of persecution, and then you know, for them to lose everything in order to come to New Zealand, their language, their culture, their family, for me to kind of be raised in a culture with equality. So I wanted to kind of capture that change and the experience that I think a lot of migrant children would relate to, as if you're old enough to kind of witness it. So I'll read from my book, just a little section where I spoke about that. I think it's a couple of minutes. My parents' adjustment was profound in a very different way than mine. For my dad, that meant going from being an educated professional working in green energy research and providing a comfortable life for his family, to accepting that he would never be an engineer again and asking strangers if they had any kind of unskilled work he could do. He went from having the status that came from being from a big, old, well-regarded family to having no social standing, no contacts or support networks to draw from at all. He went from being the center of a close-knit, boisterous group of friends to nodding and smiling as conversations he barely understood passed him by. What I noticed and still find painful is that my dad lost his keen, well-known sense of humor. In Iran, he was known as the funny one in his circle. He would do hilarious impersonations of his self-important dervish uncle for his cousins during late night sessions at our house. I remember them all doubling over with laughter. He came up with witty nicknames and taglines for every situation. The dark developments in Iranian society or politics would turn into tragicomedies, a survival tool that made him the center of attention. He joined in on our games too, took on funny characters. He was the hilarious dad for us kids. He put on funny voices. He made us laugh until until tears were rolling down our faces. I was so proud of having the cool, fun dad. But after we moved, he was still very funny, though only my mum and I had any idea of those around him. Humor doesn't translate, so he mostly stopped trying. My mother was an educated, politically minded woman, deeply into literature, involved in women's issues, and passionate about her chosen field, psychology. Suddenly, her university degree, like Dad's, was unrecognized. Decades later, when she finally had the time and facility, Mum went through the process of having her psychology degree officially converted to the University of Auckland. By then, life had moved on so far that she couldn't really face retraining as a clinical practitioner. Academia had been her dream. She wanted to eventually become a professor, teaching and writing, but the language barrier meant she could not interact with her peers in any way that reflected any of this. For many years thereafter, my mother would say that the hardest thing for her was that she couldn't make friends by sharing political discourse or having discussions about literature. She would meet people who very likely had read the same books, but for years after we moved, She couldn't convey the complexity of her thoughts well enough in English to form bonds based on any kind of social analysis. She had to resign herself to interacting as a woman with a keen interest in cooking and gardening. Witnessing that change in our parents is probably a central heartbreak of our shared experience as migrant children, at least for those of us old enough at the time of the change to still remember what they were like before. I noticed my mother smiling more, smiling all the time, which translated well in the people-pleasing world of retail and hospitality, where she ended up for the rest of her working life. My dad adopted a slightly bewildered, wide-eyed expression, which went well with perpetually asking people to repeat what they were saying. He began to bow his head a lot. Some instinct told him to appear subservient, to be less of a threat. When I think about it now, I'm breathless with awe at the memory of my parents adapting to their new positions in society, rolling with the punches that had hit so hard at the innermost sanctum of their being. I can't comprehend how they did it. I try to imagine interesting adults my age engaged in politics and alternative culture, the people in my life now, suddenly becoming impoverished migrants far from home. I don't understand how rage didn't overwhelm my parents. It's the first emotion that I think of when I imagine the fate, because the situation that forced them there was so deeply unfair. The deliberate cruelty of the regime had tipped their lives upside down, as well as the lives of millions more Iranians. That this great loss was still the best option was not fair. The total lack of control would have driven me to the point of perpetual angst. But the deeper emotion, the one that might overwhelm any of us similarly battered about, is sorrow. I feel that now, though if it was happening for my parents, they certainly never let on. That's a book.
Thank you, Golriz, for sharing this wonderful excerpt. I think it's really disheartening to hear how migrants actually have to give up a big part of who they are and even say their dreams or their characters. And it's so helpless as migrant children to witness all this. And I have a question for you. So how about, what do you feel as your identity, and what was your feeling towards your home country? I know you left Iran when you were 9 years old. And do you feel you're more Kiwi where you grew up, and or what's your connection with Middle East in the culture and in the self recognition?
Yeah, I think, I left at an age where I was 9 years old. So I remember the language and I remember my life there as a child, but it wasn't I wasn't old enough to kind of come as a fully formed person. So I very quickly adapted to Kiwi life and kind of learnt English. And I think I probably interact with the world a lot as a New Zealander in terms of that culture. But I don't think that you could ever kind of shed the identity of having been a refugee and seeing what we saw in Iran. And part of the reason I wrote the book, and also that particular excerpt, is to kind of highlight that Iranians, even though we're seen as being oppressed or oppressive in our culture, I think people don't quite understand whether we are very religious and deeply traditional, or whatever it is that they see as the regime, or whether they think that we are the victims of that regime. But actually, Iranians, as I experienced Iran, were loved things like parties and food, and people were still brewing alcohol at the risk of death, and they love music and parties, and education is really important. And more than that, the Iranians around me were incredibly political. They were constantly talking about equality and human rights and democracy, and in particular, the regime attacked women. And so, gender equality was a really big deal. And for men and women, it wasn't the case that we'd always been part of a religious regime that said that women are less than men. It was the culture is much older than that, and in fact I don't think that Islam probably is even like that, and I don't I didn't grow up with Islam in sort of my home, But I understand that that regime was using it as a tool to oppress people, and that that's very different than the community that I encounter here, for example. But I when I went into politics, people would sometimes I'd do a speech or something, and people would ask, how can we help migrants assimilate into Kiwi culture as well as you have, and I would always sort of say, oh, well, why do you think I've assimilated so well? It's such a terrible word, but that's what they would say. And and they would always sort of go, oh, well, and it would I realized it would be a compliment, so they go, oh, well, you're strong woman, you're independent, you're educated, you're dressed, like this, or whatever it was. And I would kind of go, well, I learned feminism from people who faced tanks and torture to fight for their rights. I learned about democracy from people who, were in one of the biggest popular revolutions in modern history to bring democracy to their country. That's how strong those values are for us. And I think, the idea is that as migrants, when we come here, and, when I talk about my parents, for example, in that reading, where because the language barrier is there, or because they look a certain way and people are used to seeing those narratives on the news about us, then that even the absolutely well-meaning communities in our in our adopted home country will interact with us as just kind of simple people who are probably religious or traditional, or who probably don't read books and don't have political opinions, and actually kind of, if you dig a little bit deeper, we kind of realize that our values are shared across the world. It's just sometimes in our home countries the oppressive voices are a lot louder than the ordinary people's. So I'm very proud of my Iranian heritage, but I see it very differently than people see it in pop culture.
Yeah, I think that's one key thing, is to separate the community culture from the regime, right? When
Yes.
outsiders sometimes kind of integrate the two and imagine people living under the regime must be behaving a certain way. What was very interesting is when we went to Iran, I realized that even, let's say, women live a very, very different life in different cities, like in Tehran and in Tabriz, which is the northern part, and then in Qom, right, the religious center. So like in the northern part, the women will tell me, I wish I could be in Tehran because then I can have more choices to the color of my hijab, or I can wear it lower, just covering a little bit of my neck, right? So it's like a bit of a hint on how things could be very different.
And it's amazing that they have kept that resistance. Like in the face of real danger, they're still resisting every day and that their kind of feminism looks really different. And I think we need to kind of recognize that in the West as well, because in Iran, or a place like Iran, where the patriarchy is telling women to be shapeless and colorless and sexless, the front lines, the battlefield looks very different. It looks like women sort of wearing tighter clothes, wearing more makeup, showing more, because they're saying, no, I will be colorful and sexualized and, and feminine, because the patriarchy looks different there. Whereas in Western feminism, it's something else. And, you're fighting exactly, the aesthetics looks different, but the baseline is still about women having choices and control over our bodies.
Yeah, totally. So I guess there is another question here, right? Because in New Zealand, maybe the people who have moved, or the community you are familiar with, they have integrated, or sort of using that word, done pretty well or get well educated. But there are migrant communities who are still kept very close, right, from the host countries, and there are migrants who indeed preserving a lot of their culture, which part of it is great traditional culture. On the other hand, could be really not progressive ways of treating women or looking at the world. So what's your view for such community in terms of basically what's the role of writers? Should writers be for reform within their own migrant communities through art, or should they, solely focus on how the outside or the host communities perceive them?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for voices of progress within every community. So I mean, I don't see any of our communities as being homogenous. So there are certainly communities that will move into a Western context, and working people are from more traditional backgrounds, are from more religious backgrounds, and so have less options of integrating. And when they do integrate, there's a bit of an assault on our culture, there's a degradation. So I can see why some of our communities will hold on strongly to their traditions just as a point of pride and unity, because there is hostility in some of the host communities, and we know that, and so it makes sense to me that would happen. But even within those cultures, there are voices for gender equality, for example, and it's about lifting those voices. It's about allowing our cultures to be changed and to progress and develop as led by us, not in terms of like an external force coming in. And one of the examples that I can think of is that I co-sponsored a bill that came into law updating New Zealand's laws on female genital mutilation last term. And we did that absolutely because those communities that practice female genital mutilation had asked for it. It wasn't the whole communities, but there was definitely, very strong voices, women experts from those communities that constantly would bring this to Parliament. And it was the Ethiopian community, the Kurdish community, and there was a whole lot of refugee and migrant communities that were that are seen as being very traditional and closed, but actually there are vibrant conversations happening there as well. And they wanted the law in New Zealand to reflect international law, and for them to be able to conduct education within their own communities that would then, reflect the law. And the law was actually behind where they were in terms of their conversations. And so the bill was co-sponsored by women of colour MPs from across different political parties, and it was wonderful to work with those communities there. So I think the danger is actually that it's outsiders that see our communities as being static. And we want to preserve our culture and our traditions, absolutely. But that's the same with Western culture. They can preserve some of their traditions and culture and art and, classical writing and music, but it doesn't mean that they've held on to some of the more oppressive traditions either. And there are still very oppressive traditions in Western culture as well. And, New Zealand has very high rates of domestic and sexual violence, and that's not because of one or the other of the cultures living here. It's a whole of country problem.
Wow. Yeah. So I guess since we are on this topic, I'm also wondering, there are very different groups of migrants, right? We use migrants as a sort of a blanket concept, but actually there are so many different levels of the society, and as you said, it's not static. It's constantly changing. So for example, the ones who are less privileged, less educated, less articulate about their rights, or people who are in camps in like Kenya or Bangladesh, how do you think that we, or as generally, the rest of the society can represent their condition and stories in a more forceful way so that more people can hear and care about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult, and I think as the organizers of this festival will know, it's really, really important to have specific platforms for our stories to be told by us, and in terms of different migrant groups, by each of those groups represented. I think it's probably the front line is more sort of making sure that there's representation within mainstream media, mainstream festivals eventually arising from these migrant-led initiatives. So the more we tell our stories, hopefully the more we'll be seen as being capable of telling our stories, not just as sort of witnesses that we have, you know, Western experts come and talk to, and then they go and present what they can see. But we can be the authors, we can be the musicians, we can be sort of the storytellers and the journalists as well in particular. But it's, I mean, for me, the focus would be to try and shift representation within mainstream media behind the camera and in front of the camera, because we kind of need to be on those boards that decide the funding mechanisms of of everything, and you know, the directors and the writers, as well as, you know, being represented in front of the screen, for example, or being the author in terms of a written piece. It's a really difficult question, because I think the kind of oppression that leads to us becoming displaced in the global order of things is kind of the same oppression that keeps our stories out of mainstream understanding. So being a Middle Easterner, I feel like we're seen as those people over there who are always having wars with each other, but our wars are more often than not imposed and our resources being depleted. But because we're seen as not capable of peace, and because our stories aren't being told, our weddings and our birthday parties aren't in the pictures, it's always the violence. And our literature is not seen as being kind of produced at all, it's not seen. And our films are just kind of over there in the film festivals rather than in sort of box office and festivals. So, you know, it contributes to our displacement, and then it continues while we're displaced. It's not a simple solution.
Yeah, so it's not reality. It could be, you know, part of reality that the media and film that paint, but the rest of the world just sort of pick that up and then form a sort of impression. So it's really important for migrant community to come out and give our own voice. Yeah, and
yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, if we do work in those fields, it's about kind of passing the mic, so to speak. It's sort of, I can't purport to talk for every migrant community, but I, you know, if I forged a path, it's about supporting sort of others from different kinds of communities to have that voice as well. And it can't be just, and you know, it can't just be as these token reps, you know, the representation is sort of like a famous person or a person in front of the camera or a person in parliament per se. We have to be at every stage of democracy, in the boardrooms, in local government, inside the institutions. You know, we have to be the ones writing the policies as well. And then when it comes to media, we have to be the producers and the writers, as well as the characters on the screen, for example. But you know, publishers need to look to us to kind of publish our works as well. And that means having more of us working in the publishing field. So it's about kind of making space and mainstreaming us and all of the stages that lead up to stories being told.
That's great. So, and also actually for Global Migrant Festival, our founding principle was also to give voices to the migrants themselves. So exactly as you said.
Wonderful.
Right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. Yeah. And then we share, you know, once you've got content, you can share it and hopefully have people asking for more of that kind of content, more of our stories being told by us.
Yeah, totally. So in terms of writing, and then you talk about publishing, what did you want to achieve with your writing?
Well, HarperCollins it approached me, and it was kind of after the Christchurch terror attacks happened, and I think they'd seen some content that I'd done online and some speeches, and obviously I was sort of in Parliament, and so they wanted that. I'd been approached by a couple of other publishers, and they didn't ask for a biography, and because I felt like that was quite a big thing, and I was not sure. I'm not a writer, so I had said no. But when HarperCollins came up, they said maybe you could do a series of essays about your experiences and kind of with themes around the issues that you talk about in public, and I thought, okay, that's manageable. But then when I started writing, it kind of came out as a biography. So it felt more natural or meaningful. And I think I started to think about it as well in terms of like, well, you know, there was no stories about a young refugee girl or an Iranian person or you know, someone who was, especially in New Zealand, growing up when I was growing up. So maybe there's some value in writing this story, and it can just be hopefully one of the other stories that come up. And it kind of, it meant that that I wanted to write about my background and my kind of life in New Zealand growing up, and race and sort of the gender and those things. But then I also knew that it meant something to write about my life in politics, because to a lot of people that was the real win for our communities. So it ended up being, you know, it covers a lot. It covers a lot of different, you know, me and the law, me at the United Nations when I worked in, and I went and worked in Tanzania and Arusha at the Rwanda Tribunal, and in The Hague, and then in Cambodia, and kind of having that experience of, and maybe that's, and there's, I mean, I do talk about whether I was drawn to those tribunals because, you know, someone who's lived through a regime that's so oppressive as to commit atrocities and torture and very widespread persecution, that I want to see those types of problems resolved, you know, and I was drawn to that kind of work, and then coming back here and entering politics and the way that impacted my life and the way it was portrayed. And so I guess I was trying to fill the void for myself as a young person, but I also tried to include some of what I thought maybe other people would want to read about my story.
How can we find your book? Maybe could you show the cover of the book, and in case our audience want to find this? This is on Amazon?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's available in hard copy in North America, so Canada and the United States, and also in Great Britain from the start of February. And it's on Amazon, and it's available now in Australia and New Zealand. But yeah, I think there's another couple of online stores that are sending out the hard copies, but so I know some people have gotten it in Asia and that, but yeah, it's called Know Your Place. Because
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
And that just kind of relates to kind of that journey of being displaced, and you know, changing from one very old beautiful culture to this young vibrant new world culture. But it's also about you know, what we get told as migrants when we rise to a certain level, and as women as well. Actually, I think women can relate to that idea of, like, you know, she doesn't know her place, and owning that, because we do know our place.
It's just different people have decided differently that some think that women should belong to, say, the kitchen or the backyard. But,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
We don't necessarily believe, right? It could be in the parliament.
Yes, and I get that really often as a migrant background person or a refugee. You know, I get that's kind of a very common vein of the online abuse, where it's sort of like, well, and it's the job of a politician to point out what's wrong in the system and present solutions. So every politician's, you know, doing this, you know, going, this isn't enough, this is what we need here, whether it's for environmental protection, whether it's social justice issues, whatever it is. And when I'm quoted in media, for example, just doing that very ordinary piece of work as a politician, the comments will always be like, you know, well, you know, she should go home where she's from, why is she criticizing us, you know, and that kind of know your place. You know, as a migrant, you should be silent, and you should be thankful, grateful. You should, you know, you shouldn't be behaving like you're equal, essentially, is what they're saying. Because if we were all equal as citizens, we would get to sit in parliament and we would get to criticize the systems in order to make them better. And I mean, to me, that's what patriotism would be, not settling for less than the absolute best for the country.
Wow, this is a really wonderful message. And I think that's basically when people are saying, know your place, and you give a response and say, yes, I do know my place.
Yes.
It's amazing inspiration as a woman as well. I do feel that, and I think I trust that a lot of other readers and audience will also get that power, that sense of power from you as well.
I hope so.
So,
We need more of us to kind of do it, but it's not all that safe because there is the pushback. So I think it's a real responsibility to, if you're in a position like I am, where others can see you, to kind of behave as you would like, others to be treated as an equal. And sometimes there's pushback, but it's kind of, hopefully it's making it safer for others to come up. And then eventually, as there's more of us, then we won't look so out of place.
The audience of our Global Migrant Festival is a migrant community from around the world, and also researchers who care about this topic and the general public, right? So would you be able to give some words or some, something you want to say to the audience here?
Yeah, I think I mean, my words are probably of gratitude, because I think as a refugee background woman, especially a woman of color, I've gained all of my strength and solidarity that I have in my life from others who are from all over different parts of the world, not necessarily Iranians at all, but my friend group, my group of very political supporters and people that I support and kind of trust are all from that generation of having been child migrants from wherever that might be, and experiencing the world as people of color, as migrants of color, as refugees, and in particular as women of color. And I think that solidarity between us, now that there are so many millions of us across the world that have an experience of living in a place where we were not born, we are now a new culture, and we kind of need to connect with each other. And more than that, I think we need to connect with Indigenous people as well, where we've kind of landed. There's a real connection, and there's a real commonality of experience between all of us as people who have experienced colonization or imperialism or war, and who are experiencing our lives in the West with both a level of understanding that others may not have, because we bring that from our cultures, but also a level of prejudice and challenge. But by talking to each other, I think, and validating each other, I think we can go much, much further. And I'm so grateful to my migrant community across the globe for kind of giving me the strength to do the things that I do.
Thank you, Golriz. The message is about gratitude and connection. It's great to have you here today, and especially for the diversity of the migrant voices as well, and also as a particularly strong female model of leadership. I think that's something I really appreciate myself as well. So thank you for watching our program today, and please continue to watch the other programs that the Global Migrant Festival